Hey everybody, welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. I want to talk today about climate change. It's always in the news, it seems, especially now with Donald Trump in charge, of course, and he's talking about making some changes, and including pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and so forth. So lots of people concerned. So our guest today is going to respond to some of those concerns. Tom Harris joins us. He's the executive director of the Ottawa-based not-for-profit International Climate Science Coalition. Their website, icsc-canada.com. And he actually has a new book out I want to draw your attention to. Energy and Climate at a Glance, the Canadian edition. Okay, and so good to have you with us, Tom. Tell us a bit about your new book.
Yeah, for sure. It's actually published by a new group called the Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy, based out of Toronto, and the Heartland Institute. Now, the Heartland Institute publishes Energy at a Climate at a Glance, the American edition. Well, they teamed up with the Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy, which you can check out on the web at sensiblechange.ca, and they published this. And I'm one of the contributing authors listed down below. It's written by Sterling Burnett, who's from Heartland. He's the official author, along with Ron Davidson. But as I say, I'm a contributing author. We're selling this on our homepage for $14, and people can take a look. Now, the thing that's beautiful about this book is it's very easy to read. It's got like a little sections. You know, how will Canada's net zero sacrifice impact global emissions? Like nothing. And domestic CO2 restrictions are futile and harmless. And a section that you'll especially like is towards the end. We have a section that talks about, when were the extreme weather records set? You know, so we have a graph, a map here, and it shows you that the extreme weather record for Ontario was set in 1975. For Alberta, where you are, it's 1931. Okay. And what we show is that the warming is saving lives. This is very important for people to realize. The two things that they're most concerned about, the warming and carbon dioxide, are both good things. Carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide is plant food, of course. And the only real net effect that we've seen as looked at from satellite orbit is the greening of the earth, a massive increase in the amount of vegetation across the world, as well as increase in crop productivity. You know, and we talk about that in this book, and we show you specifically the arguments that you can bring up at your town hall, at your committee meetings, things like that, to actually, ask them, okay, if Canada, for example, reduced our CO2 emissions, what impact would that have on global climate? Well, I'll give you a number that'll kind of blow you away. It turns out that Canada is 1.6% of world emissions. And Ottawa, where I live, we want to have a massive reduction to net zero. But Ottawa is less than 1% of Canada's emissions. So it turns out that if you believe that we're causing a climate crisis, which I don't believe, but if you did, and you use the UN's models, the change in temperature, if we reduced Ottawa to zero emissions or zero net emissions, by the year 2100 would be 1/10,000th of 1 degree.
Oh my, okay, those are some pretty minute numbers, for sure.
Nobody can even measure it. In fact,
well, that's a handy book to have on hand. And I'm quite sure that you've probably offended a lot of people here today, and that's okay. I don't mind if people ask questions and challenge your beliefs and your conclusions. That needs to be part of this ongoing debate in Canada. Problem is, of course, that often when you ask questions, you get some pushback and people get really upset. You can't ask questions. Well, then it's really not science if you can't ask questions, in my view. But all right, well, Tom, why don't we jump into the President Trump issues here? Of course, there's been lots of chatter in climate circles about his new head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, Lee Zeldin, his efforts to reverse the endangerment finding, which I believe was back in 2009. Can you first of all explain to our viewers what the endangerment finding is all about?
Yeah, for sure. Back in 2009, actually, it was passed, and it specifically said that CO2, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases are pollutants that should be controlled under the Clean Air Act. Now, it's interesting. It actually comes from a ruling in the Supreme Court, Massachusetts versus the EPA in 2007. You see, what the Supreme Court decided is that greenhouse gases are air pollutants. Okay, air pollutants within the EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate. And so the Supreme Court said that the EPA was required by a rulemaking petition to either determine endangerment by CO2 emissions or provide a reasonable explanation for not doing so, and that they had the authority to regulate greenhouse gases if they found that it endangered public health. So the EPA went away, and being during Obama's administration, you won't be surprised to hear that they decided that CO2, carbon dioxide, the breath of life, was in fact a pollutant that was endangering human life. So the EPA then had this thing in 2009 called the endangerment finding, and that allows them to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act as if it's a pollutant like nitrous oxide or sulfur dioxide or whatever. And that has led to a massive change in regulations in the United States, things like Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and all these different things that allow them then to regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. Now, on the very first day of President Trump's administration, he actually signed an executive order. He signed lots of them, but here's one, and this deals with the endangerment finding. It's called Unleashing American Energy. And he gave the EPA administrator, as you mentioned, a 30-day deadline to submit recommendations on the legality and continuing applicability of the 2009 endangerment finding. And the rumor is now that he's done that. He's submitted his recommendations. The Washington Post said that insiders are saying that he's recommending that the EPA's endangerment finding be withdrawn. And that would be a very, very good thing, because it would take the rug out from under many of these really insane carbon dioxide reduction regulations and things like that. And, it's interesting, Paul, in Canada, a similar situation occurred when Paul Martin was the Prime Minister. You see, we have something in Canada called the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's like their Clean Air Act in the U.S. And on it, they have listed various substances, toxic substances like PCBs and mercury and lead and things like that. And Paul Martin added carbon dioxide to the list of toxic substances. Now, you'd think this was right out of Yes Minister. It was so silly. He listed CO2 on that list, and then right beside it, it said, "This is not a toxic substance." So
wait a minute. So you're saying this is okay? A whole list of toxic substances.
Yeah.
And then CO2, but then a little asterisk caveat. Oh, by the way, this isn't actually a toxic substance. So why is it there?
Yeah, they wanted to be able to control it under CEPA. That's why it was there. But it had this little note. It's, as I say, it's a bit like Monty Python. Here's our list of toxic substances, which includes substances that are not toxic. But anyway.
Except when we want it to be.
Yeah, exactly. So Stephen Harper got up in the House of Commons. He was an opposition leader. And he said, "This is insane. You're saying it's not toxic, so why are you putting it on toxic list?" And of course, the government said, so that we can control it under the CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So you would think that when Prime Minister Harper, became our prime minister, that he would take the CO2 off the toxic substance list, but he didn't do it. He didn't do it in the whole length of time he had to actually. So he complained about it ahead of time, but when he came into power, and this is something conservatives often do, they campaign on a particular position, but when they get into power, they're very politically correct. Oh my goodness, have to.
Well, I think there's probably some worry about, okay, is it going to have some pushback on voters, right?
Oh yeah,
and that's the concern. But a lot of, I suppose it's a political hot potato. The scientific question then is CO2. And again, we call it carbon, but it's actually carbon dioxide. So there's a big difference there, as you point out. Is it a danger to human health? Is it a danger to the environment? Is it a pollutant? And what's the answer?
Well, the answer is in this section of our new book. There is no climate crisis. Okay, it turns out that carbon dioxide. It actually, at today's level, it has very little additional impact on temperature. It's a little bit like painting the side of a barn red. When you put one coat of paint on, it changes the color a great deal. Second coat of paint changes it a little bit more. Third and fourth coats of paint, they increase the weathering capability of the barn, of course, but it doesn't really change the temperature. It doesn't change the color. But that analogy works perfectly with CO2, because it turns out at today's level of CO2, which is about 420 parts per million, we're right at the point where a doubling of CO2 will make very little change, because the atmosphere is saturated with carbon dioxide. And in fact, the same thing with methane and nitrous oxide, which, of course, nitrous oxide is the concern for farmers because they want them to restrict their fertilizer use to reduce nitrous oxide. But the interesting thing here is that Will Happer from Princeton University, along with a colleague whose name I can't pronounce, unfortunately, at York University, did very serious infrared studies. Because, of course, the theory is that the sunlight comes through the CO2, which is transparent to normal sunlight. It comes through, it heats up the ground. The ground emits infrared heat, which, as I say, is heat, it's radiation. And the CO2 and other greenhouse gas molecules absorb some of that and re-radiate it back to Earth. Now, Will Happer and this professor from York University, they show that we're at a point now where you can double CO2 and the temperature change would be very, very little. So they've put out this paper, and I'll send it to you afterwards. You can share it with the listeners.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. Yeah, and this is peer reviewed.
Oh yeah, totally.
Right? I mean, these aren't kids in junior high doing a study here.
No, Will Happer actually was the science advisor for Trump during the first year of his first administration. And it's interesting because he tells the story of what went on. He tried to get them to actually develop sensible climate policy, which would be adaptation to climate change, not magically trying to stop it, okay? Because we don't have a control knob on the atmosphere.
Right.
And we actually go into that in our book, where we talk about the fact that the only measurable effect of CO2 has been a massive increase, as I say, in crop productivity and in densification of forests. We see that in some areas of the Sahara Desert, for example, we're seeing it greening. Okay, the desert is greening.
Wow, so that's actually a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very good thing, of course.
Okay.
And you'd laugh, Paul, when I worked in the House of Commons as a legislative assistant for Bob Mills, who was the opposition environment critic for the old Canadian Alliance. They brought in a fellow from the World Bank, and he showed a big map of productivity of the world in the year 2050. And what it showed is that we could farm right up to near James Bay. I mean, it was wonderful. So I didn't realize that in these presentations, you're not supposed to ask embarrassing questions. So I put up my hand and I said, oh, you're speaking to a group of Canadian MPs, and what you're showing is that because of greenhouse warming, Canada will do much better. We'll have like twice as much land to actually farm, and we'll have less severe winters. Who's going to be why would we be against that? And of course, there was dead silence, and the MP look and they say, oh, yeah. I mean, Canada's going to do much better, Mr. World Bank. So why are you talking to MPs in Canada about, this supposed crisis? But so I mean, the climate scare has been really driven by an ideology. It's not driven by science. And it's interesting because I just finished writing an article about the IPCC, and this is another big Trump development. I don't know if you heard this, but he's now forbid U.S. scientists, U.S. government scientists, from working with the IPCC on their next Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Okay, now this is the big report that informs the big climate change conferences that the UN has every year. Now, this is a big deal because the U.S. puts in more money, more data, more scientists by far than any other group. And in fact, it's interesting. Some of the IPCC scientists said that without the U.S. in it, the IPCC is dead. Okay, now the IPCC, it's interesting. When it was launched in 1988, it was a pretty honest organization. And it did, in fact, say that we didn't have enough data to conclude that humans were making a significant contribution to climate change. That was their first assessment report in 1990. But a big thing happened in 1992. That was at the Rio Earth Summit. Brian Mulroney went there, and he signed the document, or at least his representatives did, along with the first George Bush. And it was called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so the politicians decided that there was a climate emergency. And the IPCC's mandate was changed to not just look at, not look at all the different impacts of climate, which would of course include natural things like the sun and everything else. The IPCC's mandate was changed to only look at the human cause of climate change and to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So right from 1992 until the present day, the IPCC has the job of supporting what the politicians decide. And
Well,
so
that seems rather backwards. I
I
mean,
know.
we shouldn't have politicians doing science and maybe not having scientists doing politics. I mean, it sounds presumptuous to me, if I'm hearing this correctly,
Oh, yeah.
that here's our science assignment. Find out, the human causes of, what's changing our climate. Well, if it's very minimal, then what about the other effects on our climate, and that's causing change? Again, if you're going to do science, if I understand science correctly, you're always asking questions. You're looking at all the possibilities, not leaving, this one out and that one out because it doesn't suit our ideology.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it gets even worse because the way the IPCC reports are released every 5 years, they released a thing called the Summary for Policymakers. Now, you would assume that the driving facts for the Summary for Policymakers would be the original science document. But according to the IPCC's internal rules, here's what happens. The science document is mostly finished. Then they write the Summary for Policymakers, which is agreed to line by government representatives. They have the final say. The Summary for Policymakers then is released to the public. It gets all the big headlines and everything else. And guess what they then do with the science report? The science report, and this is right in the IPCC rules, and it'll be an article that I'm writing next week on America Out Loud, and I'll be citing right from their rules. The science report is tuned to match the summary report that's already released.
So now, that's reverse order of the way it should be. Completely upside down.
Imagine in the office, you're working on a document and your boss says, okay, I want the summary. Say, well, I haven't actually finished the report, so can you wait before I... No, I want the summary and I want it to say this. Well,
yeah,
I'm not
exactly.
sure if that actually is what my report says. You're going to have to tune your report to say the summary reports. And I wanted to say this. And, one of my sisters who used to work for the government, she said, this is a reverse of evidence-based decision-making.
Yes.
What it is it's decision-based evidence-making. Okay, that was the expression. So
yeah, that's a funny way of putting it, but I think hits the nail on the head.
Yeah,
my.
On one occasion of finding the references, the scientific references to support what the minister said. Okay, so she went away and she couldn't find any. So she came back and she said to them, well, I can't find any scientific references to support. No, look harder and harder. And that's when she told me, said, this is decision-based evidence making. I've got to find it.
Oh, so, I mean, Lord help us. I mean, I mean, this is why we are where we're at right now.
That's right.
These kinds of backwards, dishonest, disingenuous, ways of communicating to the public here. I mean, wow. Fact, okay.
You'd laugh. Richard Lindzen, who's a professor of meteorology from MIT, he says that in the case of the IPCC, the conclusions were reached before the science was even done. Okay.
Yeah. There's something very, very, very wrong with that, and I think our viewers would agree. If that's what's happening, I mean, we've had enough. Basically, we want to get back to some common sense here, right? We need to wise up. So, you know what? Let me talk. Can you chat a bit about our current? I mean, at least at the time of this taping, so Liberal leadership candidate Mark Carney. He's the perceived front runner, likely to be the next prime minister. So he will immediately remove the consumer carbon tax, is what he says, if he becomes PM. And he'll increase the industry carbon tax. So the large greenhouse gas emitters would pay more, right? Yeah. Now, he believes this would lower emissions. So would that lower emissions somehow?
Well, yes, it would. But the trouble is the big companies have to stay in business, so they'll pass the cost on to us. So we may end up paying just as much. We just pay in a different format. And, we have to be really concerned about Mark Carney. I mean, first of all, he was the UN Special Rapporteur or whatever they call it for climate change. And he wrote a book. It was published in 2021, which gives us an inside view of what Mark Carney really thinks should be done. And in that book, it's called Values. He talks about various things. He loves carbon tax. He thinks that carbon tax should cover the whole world. But the other thing he does, which I think should really scare Canadians, is he talks about the need for having a carbon allowance, a carbon dioxide allowance, not just for companies, but for individuals. Individual citizens then would have a certain amount of carbon dioxide they can emit in a year based on their activities, whether they're traveling or whether they...
Does that mean I have to eat less beans? What if I like beans?
That's right, exactly. So they did propose this in the UK, and of course they made a lot of fun of it. They said, oh, this is insane. But Carney actually thinks it should be done according to his book. So he's actually a dangerous person. I mean, he's a real zealot. Trudeau was, of course, a climate activist in his own way, but Carney is much, much more. And from that...
If I could jump in there for a second, he does admit that he's an elitist globalist, and so, at least he's, I guess, being honest about that part. But that typically includes, again, digital currency, digital ID. And so by default, if you follow that through to its logical conclusion, that means if we're going to assign, these limits on carbon emissions to individuals and family units, then Big Brother is going to be watching you. And if you go over that limit, they could perhaps, for example, freeze your bank accounts. Not that that's ever happened in Canada before. Hey, truckers, wow.
Well, yeah,
that's concerning. That's concerning.
So if we have individual carbon budgets for individual citizens, what would happen is that when you go to book your flight to Spain for a holiday with your credit card, you're going to suddenly find your credit card won't let you fly to Spain. It'll say, oh, you could fly to Quebec City. Because you've used up most of your carbon credits. And so that's the concern, is that he really thinks that we should actually have individual carbon budgets and that we can't exceed that amount. Now, the whole point of this is that it isn't carbon, first of all. We have to stop using their language. This is one of the troubles that, it's interesting, Paul, in 1984, the book, they have an appendix all about Newspeak. And the whole theory was a 10-page appendix. It's really worth reading, even if you haven't read the book, 1984. It actually talks about how the language chosen by people actually influences their thinking pattern. And in the climate scare, there's a whole lot of newspeak, 1984 newspeak. First of all, we call it carbon emissions. It's not carbon emissions, it's carbon dioxide. Carbon is soot. Or diamonds or graphite. I mean, that is carbon, Yeah. If I take this pencil and I throw it up into the air, that would be carbon emissions, But carbon dioxide is plant food. It's invisible. We can't smell it. It's not toxic in any way. And in fact, CO2 in Earth's atmosphere has been 100%, not 100%, 1,000% of today's levels, at various times in the past. In other words, 10 times more CO2 than we have today. And if you look at the graphs, and in fact, we have that graph in here, we actually show that at various times when CO2 was very high, the Earth was very cold. Now that's an interesting graph. It's right here. It shows, it shows temperature, and it shows the actual conditions on Earth, and it shows the CO2 levels. And this, Paul, is what brought me over to being a climate realist, we call it, a climate realist instead of an alarmist. I used to use Venus as an example of what could happen on the Earth if we let CO2 get too high, because CO2 on Venus is 95% of the atmosphere, and Venus, of course, the surface of Venus is hot enough to melt lead. That's one of the reasons that it's super hot. But a local professor here, who doesn't want me to mention his name, because it's dangerous. Tim
wants
Ball,
to keep his job,
I mean, Tim Ball had 5 death threats, Roy Spencer in the United States, he had bullet holes put through his office window from a climate protest. So anyway, the bottom line is, when this scientist showed me the graphs of carbon dioxide over geologic time, which is about 500 million years, and temperature, the thing that stood out to me was this. Around 440 million years ago, long before humans were even a molecule, we had CO2 levels of 10 times today. 1,000% of today. I'm not talking about the measly 50% rise.
And it didn't get warmer, it got cooler.
It was the coldest in the last 500 million years at 440 million years ago. And so what you see in that graph is there's no correlation between temperature and CO2. Sometimes CO2 is high and temperature is high. Sometimes they're opposite, etc. There really isn't any drivers. Now, in recent millennia, I guess you could say, recent hundreds of thousands of years, we have seen that CO2 rises when temperature rises first. So what happens is, let's say you had a can of pop on your counter in the kitchen and you just took it out of the fridge. Well, as it warms up, it releases CO2, and you see the bubbles, the carbon dioxide bubbles are coming out of the water. The water releases CO2 into the air, and that's what happens with the oceans. As the oceans warm up gradually over many decades, it releases CO2. So in recent millennia, we've actually seen CO2 rise after temperature rise, and the lag can be huge. The lag can be as much as 800 years.
So this ties in probably with urbanization then, right? And you get so much heat coming out of our cities and so forth, and we measure the temperatures there and go, hey, it's things are rising here, and then CO2 increases, and that's part of the issue. I'm going to have to leave it there because the clock is just ticking here. That doesn't change. Sure. The time keeps on going, right? Tom, I want to thank you for your time here. You've caused us to think, which is a good thing. That's science, right? So I want to steer people to icsc-canada.com and the new book that you contribute toward here as well, Energy and Climate at a Glance, the Canadian edition. And again, this is where we need to get ourselves informed. So when we have conversations with our neighbors or at the office, we can supply some evidence and say, hey, have you thought about this, right? This is important. Thanks so much, Tom. And thank you for watching, everyone. Tell your friends about us. Again, WizeUp.ca. Love to have you be part of our team here. All right. Bye for now.